Today we'll look at endocrine and cell communication part 2. The focus of this presentation is on the endocrine system, the portion of your body that actually produces the hormones that serve in cell communication. When we consider the framework, our curriculum framework indicates that we are supposed to be able to identify that endocrine signals are made by endocrine cells. They release these signal molecules. The molecules are specific, and they can travel long distances through the blood to reach all parts of your body. So that's what you want to hang on to today is any examples that you find that are interesting or easy for you to understand of how an endocrine signal is produced, what cells produce it, its target, where it's going, and then what its actions are going to be. In addition, we'll look at some of the regulatory pathways for these communication activities. Hormones are really significant in our bodies, though, and often hormone disorders or diseases related to hormones are really hard to diagnose because the system is fairly complex and fairly interactive. So here's an example I wanted to share with you about oxytocin. For the longest, oxytocin was, its role was identified as being limited to inducing birth contractions during labor. And so there's a disorder that's being studied called Williams syndrome. And children who have Williams syndrome are very trusting. They don't meet a stranger. One of the mothers that was describing her concern about her child that has Williams syndrome was saying that, for the child's safety, she tried to teach the child that you can't just walk up to and trust anyone. And further investigation into this child revealed that the oxytocin in his body was not being processed properly, and it was causing or inducing this extra normal trust in people, and help lead to a better understanding of oxytocin's role. It's just very interesting to me that something as personal as whether or not I trust someone may be directly tied to how much oxytocin I am or am not producing at a specific time. And so that's just an example of how significant of an impact our hormones can have on us. Another example might be growth hormone. That kids or people who are shorter than they desire to be, for example, now can have growth hormone injections, of course with a doctor's approval, but you can get an increased level of growth activity simply from injections of the growth hormone. So these hormones that we produce in our body have profound impacts on how our body functions or dysfunctions, as the case may be in some disorders. So our endocrine system is really important, and the human endocrine system is basically a collection of glands that secrete these hormones. The chemicals, the hormones, go a fairly long distance across our body or through our body, and they help control just the everyday functioning of our cells, of our tissues, organs, as well as organ systems. So we have some 30 different known chemicals that serve as hormones in our body, and they help maintain homeostasis and promote normal body functions. We have about 9 glands, as well as a few cells that are found inside some major organs that also secrete these hormones. Now, the endocrine system is a ductless system, so these chemicals are secreted across the surface of their gland. They don't squirt out like through a salivary gland might go through a duct, the saliva might, where hormones are excreted across the surface or secreted across the surface of the gland that produces them. And these hormones can regulate all sorts of functions in our body, like our metabolism, how quickly we grow and develop, our tissue function, our sleep and wake cycles, our mood, and even our ability to trust, as I mentioned with oxytocin. People who study the endocrine system are called endocrinologists, and they would be considered medical specialists because this is a fairly diverse and intermingled body system set, which makes it fairly concentrated. So when you look at, you should have a blank diagram, I hope, of the endocrine system. And I'd like for you to think about where these different parts are labeled. So on your diagram, label the endocrine glands that you see here. You may want to stop the video in order to have time to label your diagram. Now, you're not going to be expected to memorize where all these glands are located, but I wanted you to see the diagrams so that you can identify some very specific examples. You should be able to use a specific example of a gland and tell how it is involved in cell communication. So we'll look at some examples today, and you'll be able to isolate one that you feel like you could describe well or that you could use in a specific example. So when we look at what hormones are produced by these, you may want to add that to your diagram. If you already know hormones that are produced by any of these, you may want to go ahead and add that in now. For example, you may already know that insulin is produced by the pancreas. I would suspect you could identify a hormone made by the ovaries, estrogen, and likely you can also already identify hormones that are made by the testes, which would be a classic example would be testosterone. But let's look at a little more obscure gland like the pineal gland. The pineal gland makes melatonin, and melatonin helps with regulation of our sleep cycle. The pituitary gland is a significant gland producing a lot of hormones. Growth hormone would be an example of a hormone secreted by your pituitary gland. Growth hormone. The thyroid gland produces calcitonin. It works with the parathyroid gland, which produces a hormone called parathyroid hormone. And the two glands work together to regulate the amount of calcium that's found within our bloodstream. Another fairly famous gland would be the adrenal gland. You see the kidney back here, sitting right on top of the kidney. There's the adrenal gland, which produces adrenaline or epinephrine. And you can see the paired kidneys, both of which have an adrenal gland that sits right atop that kidney. The pancreas, a nice, easy to remember example is insulin, which is involved with glucose regulation in our body. And then we've already mentioned the ovaries produce estrogen, while the testes produce testosterone. So you might want to get an additional blank diagram and make sure that you can find these individual glands. Not so much that you would be able to label them. I just want to make sure that you could speak to them. For example, if you see on top of this kidney, what was the name of that gland, what does it produce, and what's its action? It's not necessarily that you're going to be asked to name the gland on a picture, but you should be able to tell what gland sits on top of the kidney and produces adrenaline, and then be able to speak to this endocrine gland and how it is involved in long distance communication, as was indicated by the curriculum framework that said that we needed to be able to describe that process. So when we look at just the glands themselves, I'm hoping that you will remember an example of a hormone made by each. And then take an example and make sure that you could show how they regulate some feature of the body. For example, thyroid and parathyroid regulate the levels of calcitonin or calcium in the bloodstream through the secretion of PTH and calcitonin. By the time we finish this unit, you should be able to speak to regulation or maintenance of homeostasis through the use of hormones secreted by these specific glands. So the endocrine system works with the nervous system. We've studied the nervous system already and learned how that particular system can detect stimuli and respond to it, and now we'll see an integration with the endocrine system, and together those two systems are our communication system for the body. They work together in order to cause specific responses. And so the endocrine system is made up of a series of glands that make these hormones, and a number of glands that signal each other in sequence are usually referred to as an axis. For example, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis just means a set of those glands that are working together. And we'll also see that the nervous system is involved, of course, in communication. Usually these are fairly rapid communications, and our endocrine communications can be rapid, but also they can be fairly slow responses, like growth, for example. You're not going to respond to a growth hormone rapidly. That's a continual, repeated response that you have to that hormone. And so the two systems work together in order to have the communication processes occur in your body as they are needed. Can you think of where the gland, like the hypothalamus, do you remember from your diagram where the hypothalamus was located? What about the pituitary gland? Where are those two glands located? I hope you're thinking in the region of the brain. And these areas, the hypothalamus is a part of the brain that receives some information from the nervous system. So it is stimulated by the nervous system, and then it goes through a series of responses, a series of activities or actions that cause some very specific responses in your body. So the nervous system communicates to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is attached to the pituitary. So here we're seeing this axis where one gland is connected to another. So the hypothalamus is attached to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is divided into two portions, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Both of them secrete hormones when directed to secrete them by the hypothalamus. So we see that here all those players are connected. The nervous system is connected to the hypothalamus in that that's from whom the stimulus is received. And then the hypothalamus works on the pituitary gland, both the front part of the pituitary as well as the back part, or the posterior pituitary. And here's a diagram you can see. We're looking in the brain region. And so here's the hypothalamus. Remember, it is stimulated by the nervous system, and then when it receives a signal causing it to act, it acts by stimulating the anterior or the posterior pituitary to secrete a particular hormone. We look at what hormones can be secreted by the posterior pituitary, this back portion. Notice it's in the back, like your eyes would be in the front of this brain. And the posterior pituitary is the back portion of the pituitary gland. So when the hypothalamus stimulates the posterior pituitary, basically there are two hormones. The one that I mentioned to you, oxytocin, which is going to cause milk secretion in females and also cause contraction of the uterus. And as I mentioned earlier, it also plays a role in our social behaviors, particularly in our ability to trust one another. So that hormone is a product of the posterior pituitary. And then the antidiuretic hormone, which does just what its name says, antidiuretic, which means against the water. It is going to promote retention of water by the kidneys, so it's going to save water instead of acting as a diuretic, which would release water. Antidiuretic hormone promotes the retention of water by your kidneys. So the nervous system stimulates the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus stimulates the posterior pituitary when there is a need for milk, for uterine contractions, or and a separate, completely separate communication pathway if there's a need for your body to retain water, if you've been losing too much water or don't have enough fluid in your system. Antidiuretic hormone would cause the retention of fluids, particularly water. And so we see that connection where there's a neurosecretory cells that are stimulated by neurons to secrete a neurohormone, and that neurohormone is going to cause the production of, or the release of, the antidiuretic hormone or the oxytocin. Notice their targets, they're going to special cells. Antidiuretic obviously is going to go to the kidneys and cause them to be less likely to lose water, instead to retain water and put it back into the bloodstream. Where oxytocin is going to have target cells in the mammary glands to produce milk, or in the uterine muscles to cause the increase in muscle contractions. So we see here we have this relatedness of the nervous system and the endocrine system that allow us to see a connection, an interconnection of two systems helping to regulate or maintain homeostasis. So we have the hypothalamus stimulating the secretion of, let's say, oxytocin. Oxytocin then is going to cause mammary glands to produce milk, and so those glands will produce milk while the muscles are going to produce those muscle contractions. Now the front part of that pituitary gland, remember the anterior pituitary, has a whole different set of hormones that it produces. It is controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus also regulates the activities of the anterior pituitary. There is a prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus that stimulates this portion of the pituitary gland to release prolactin, which has a role in milk production. You can see lactose kind of similarity here. Remember we talked about lactose intolerant people. We see a connection with the production of that lactose-laden milk here by stimulating the anterior pituitary to release that hormone, and then that's going to cause more milk to be produced. Another example of an anterior pituitary hormone would be the thyroid stimulating hormone, and rather than saying its whole name, it is often abbreviated as TSH. The thyroid stimulating hormone, guess what it's going to do? It is going to stimulate the thyroid. So this is a region of the brain. The anterior pituitary is in your brain, and is going to go stimulate the thyroid. Do you remember where the thyroid gland is located on the diagram that you labeled? I hope you're thinking in the neck chest region, because that's where your thyroid is located, and it is stimulated by a gland in the brain. The hormone that's released travels through the bloodstream to the thyroid gland. So here we see the target cell is going to be the thyroid gland. The ligand would be TSH, and the secreting cell is going to be cells of the anterior pituitary. So we have a secreting cell, a ligand, and we have a target cell in this case, which is going to be the thyroid. Now what happens when TSH stimulates the thyroid will produce thyroxine, and that's going to stimulate metabolic activity. And so it helps us with our digestive process and the just general metabolism of our individual cells. Here you can see again the hypothalamus. Remember, it has neurosecretory cells. Those cells secrete their chemical, which goes into the vessels, the blood vessels, and is carried to the anterior and posterior pituitary. In this case, we're looking at the anterior pituitary. So the endocrine cells that are in this gland produce a variety of hormones. Here are 6 that are mentioned. Notice how they have that H after them. These are all tropic hormones, which means they actually work on another gland. So the anterior pituitary gland sends a chemical to another gland, and then that gland causes a specific hormone. So here, if we follow the track of FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, it is going to go to the ovaries, for example, and cause the production of follicle. Luteinizing hormone then could also go to the ovary and cause release of egg during the female cycle. If we look at TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, that's the one I just described to you in the earlier slide, where this tropic hormone goes to the thyroid and causes the thyroid to be stimulated to produce hormones that actually work with our metabolism. ACTH, the adrenal cortex, is its target cell, which is, remember, part of the adrenaline gland, which is on top of the kidneys. Another hormone from the anterior pituitary is prolactin. You may remember the root word here, that lactin or lactose, which is the sugar in milk. Prolactin is the hormone that causes the mammary glands to make the milk in the first place. Another hormone is the melanocyte stimulating hormone, which causes our melanocytes in our skin cells to produce more melanin. And then our very last hormone in this list of those being produced by the anterior pituitary is the growth hormone. Growth hormone does just what its name implies. It stimulates growth of areas of the body. So it's not surprising that bone tissue is one of its target tissues. So the cells in the skeletal system respond to the presence of growth hormone and will elongate, and we find that growth hormone does stimulate increase in height and long bone length. The liver cells are also stimulated by growth hormone, as are fat cells or adipose tissue. In fact, you may have heard of growth hormone as it makes the news sometimes because it's available for prescription use for people who are showing slow or sluggish growth rates. But it's also used by people who want to have increased muscle mass, or some even think it postpones aging, and so it's touted as a fountain of youth kind of drug, but has not clinically been shown to do a lot to delay senescence or aging in the human body, but it's still getting a lot of airtime, particularly on internet sites where you can purchase quote growth hormone supplements. Although really it's not FDA approved to be sold like that. It has to be available by prescription only. But that's one of the more famous anterior pituitary hormones, is the human growth hormone. So there are a variety of hormones produced in our body. You don't need to memorize all these hormones, but you do need to be able to focus on some specific ones and be able to talk about how, use it as an example to explain how our cells communicate with one another. So how does a cell in your brain end up communicating with a cell at the tip of a growth plate in the bottom of your leg, for example? And so when you look at these specific examples that I've given you, you may want to remember some of the major glands and just pick one and use it as the example that you'll hang on to, so to speak, when you write essays in the course or free response. Pancreas would be a good one to use. The pancreas gland secretes two hormones, insulin and glucagon, and we'll look at them in more depth as we move through this unit. Also, the adrenal gland has a paired set of hormones that it produces, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and they have sort of opposite effects, and so that might also be a good example or pair to look at, to hold on to. But any of them that you find of interest that would serve you as examples when you're writing your free responses would be good. Let's look at the thyroid example, the thyroid regulation. This is an example of what's called a cascade pathway, and that was one of our expectations from the curriculum framework, is that you will understand cascades in a pathway. And so when we consider the thyroid regulation, a hormone can stimulate the release of a series of other hormones and end with a non-endocrine cell being a target cell, and that would be in a hormone cascade pathway. So the release of thyroid hormones is the result of a cascade pathway like I described to you, where we had the hypothalamus is the gland or the part of the brain that was stimulated by the nervous system, and then it in turn stimulated the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary then, remember, produced thyroid stimulating hormone, and that hormone went to its target cells in the thyroid gland, and then those produced activities to help with metabolism in the body. So we see this connection or interconnected sequence, and that's called a hormone cascade pathway. So this is a good example of a hormone cascade pathway that you could hold on to. And usually those involve a negative feedback so that the process is also regulated or can be regulated through this negative feedback loop. When we move to an example, I'm going to show you just part of this little video clip on negative feedback, which is going to describe how through a cascade pathway you can end up regulating that pathway through feedback in the end. So you should have this paper with you. If you don't, then stop the video now and find your copy of this so that you can label it and take a few notes as we go through the video clip. I'm going to show you an example of one of those pathways. This particular one, we're going to start with the hypothalamus and show how negative feedback can be used to regulate this pathway. So you may want to listen carefully, take a few notes as this process is described.
The hypothalamus initiates a chain of events that control the endocrine system. It releases hormones that trigger the anterior pituitary to release more hormones. These hormones, in turn, control a variety of endocrine organs, such as the adrenal glands. Although the hypothalamus drives the system, the hypothalamus is kept in check by a negative feedback loop. Let's look at a negative feedback loop using the hormones of the adrenal cortex as an example. In response to stress signals, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH triggers the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH, in turn, triggers the adrenal cortex to release a steroid hormone called cortisol. Cortisol has many effects on different target organs in the body, but the primary one is to increase glucose in the blood. This sugar is an energy resource that allows the body to respond to physiological or psychological stress. In addition to acting on organs and tissues throughout the body, the hormones travel through the bloodstream back to the brain, where they inhibit the release of CRH. Without CRH, the anterior pituitary does not release ACTH. In addition to this effect, the cortisol also acts directly on the anterior pituitary to inhibit ACTH release. Without ACTH, the adrenal cortex stops releasing cortisol. This interaction is an example of a negative feedback loop. In this loop, the output of the system, the hormones from the adrenal cortex, ultimately diminish the input from the system, the hormones from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. This system turns on cortisol release, but then turns it off before cortisol levels get too high.
to cold. All right, hopefully your example looks something like this. We have a sensory neuron who detects the cold, and that stimulates the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to secrete a tropic hormone. That tropic hormone is going to be released by that neurosecretory cell, remember, and be carried a very short distance in the bloodstream to that anterior pituitary. So the blood vessel, again, is the delivery mechanism. Doesn't have to go very far, but still these were separate parts, separate areas of the brain, and so traveling through the bloodstream means we are now involving a hormone. The anterior pituitary will be stimulated to produce tropic hormone. Now the tropic hormone's target cell, remember, is the thyroid gland, and your thyroid is a fairly long distance away from your anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is in your brain, so that hormone will be released, picked up by the bloodstream, and then circulated through your body, and the cells that are the target cells will let that hormone in because they have receptors. So the tropic hormone is taken in by the receptors of the endocrine cell in the thyroid gland, and that cell is going to respond to the stimulus by producing T3 or T4, either of those thyroid hormones. And those thyroid hormones then are delivered through the different parts to the different parts of your body through your general circulatory system, and those cells will increase their metabolism. They'll increase their chemical activity, going through more chemical reaction to release heat, and that heat energy is what causes our body to warm up in response to this cold. And so the hormone that's secreted actually can go back and serve as a negative feedback, inhibiting the hypothalamus action as well as the anterior pituitary action, so thereby reducing the levels of TRH that are produced and the levels of TSH that are produced in response to a higher level or higher presence of T3 and T4 in your bloodstream. So we see this cascade pathway that is self-regulating, and that's how our body can maintain homeostasis using both, in this case, both the nervous system and the endocrine system to help our body respond to something as simple as a stimulus that there's cold, that there's been a decline in temperature in some specific body part. So you should practice describing this pathway. Say it out loud to a partner. Go through it multiple times until you feel comfortable describing how cell communication can be accomplished using both the nervous system and the endocrine system. Look, we also have involved the circulatory system. So here's a beautiful example of how three distinct systems are working to help your body maintain homeostasis. So that, and when you can do that, then you have a strong understanding of this endocrine system and how it functions to help our body maintain homeostasis. So I'll see you next time when we talk more about the actual action of this communication that's occurring between the hormone and the actual receptor cell.